Conversation and learning. Tackling ableism at work. Dr. Laura Chapman, please call me Mole. This presentation can help with a supported conversation on organizational change. Key questions. 1. Invitation. How do we begin a conversation about disability within a wider culture that speaks to individualized problems and medical solutions to matters of well-being? 2. Society, language and culture, because we rarely articulate the discrimination and inequality disabled individuals face, it is greatly underestimated by many. Yet disadvantage is a huge cost to disabled people and their families, to organizations and to society more widely. 3. Respectful language. Voicing our fears about disability helps us understand the problem as a lack of fluency and understanding on the subject. Learning about discrimination, as a protected characteristic, helps add nuance and perspective to our wording of who is affected by what. 4. Bias and barriers. Distortions found in text, where disability is equated to illness or viewed as a personal problem to be remedied, prevents us from talking about prejudice and discrimination as systemic issues or societal disadvantage. 5. Institutional discrimination and societal injustice. The way we talk about disabled people as a population, not simply individuals, within society, is critical to how we speak about organizational commitment. 7. Responsibility, an ability to respond to disabled storytellers as authors, ensuring we state their interests in our stories, helps acknowledge disabled people's voices and will ensure a growing legitimacy in organizational accounts. 8. Accountability, an allied response demands action that prioritizes the interests of those most disadvantaged first, then extending to working practice more widely, and asking how we can change societal injustice. A fair world. I've been facilitating disability equality training for 30+ years, and invariably the feedback I hear most often is I never knew what I needed to know. Many will say they've never thought about what disability means to disabled people, organizations and society. They have assumed the problem is someone else's. The assumption is that disability is a personal or a health issue, possibly a problem for health or social care, but not within the remit of professional commitment or organizational duty. Sadly, these assumptions become unchallenged beliefs that often sit far deeper in our hearts than in our heads as worded thoughts we can question. Therefore, what is assumed aren't even ideas we challenge for ourselves, they are often hidden so deep they can't be questioned. The landscape we live in, the culture around us in conversation, text and media, informs our mindscapes, as we bathe in words and images we rarely question, to use Sergiovanni's metaphors. Therefore, rather than try to identify which identity gives us more power or disadvantage, it may be that deciding where to lend our strength is far more critical in addressing inequality more widely. I can voice my anger against racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, religious intolerance, and help protect family and gender choice, without rejecting anybody's personal experience. However, I will need to acknowledge the voices of other groups face in order to take a stand against different discriminations in turn. I can't agree without others without understanding their perspective. My allyship as a sister, a friend, a colleague and a neighbor is in the action I take to minimize the harm that heads their way. Only they can decide if I'm addressing their interests, or that I've acted to make our shared space safer. I can't call myself an ally, but others may call on it, and hopefully rely on it. Trust. I undertook my research because, as a trustee, I was continually baffled by the lack of reference to the voice of disabled people, deaf and disabled people's organizations or disability equality in strategic conversation. While the people around me were sometimes fluent in their idea of feminism, they had no language to articulate the discrimination imposed on the disabled population. As I once described it, you could put 10 feminists in a room and get 10 definitions, but few could put a single word to the widespread and toxic nature of the inequality imposed on the disabled population. Omitting the situation disabled people face from strategic conversation does little to include their experience in storytelling more widely. Rather, it makes us believe their ideas are irrelevant to many conversations, some of which affect them directly. When it comes to matters relating to disability, many don't know what they do not know. Which means many often ignore, reinvent, or distort disabled people's interests based on the tales they've heard about them. Trust is key because positive exchanges are banked, and leads to a mutual respect that builds up over time. What does disability mean to you? What do you already know? Where's the evidence? Record words and images that come to mind about disability. How do you think we react to these words? What emotions do you think they stir? Please do pause and consider this, or have a conversation about it. 1. Invitation. How do we begin a conversation about the barriers disabled people face, and the disability discrimination they encounter, in order to be proactive about a safe space for all? Hopefully most will be along this journey already, because some of the people we work with have. It makes sense to address this matter in a proactive way before we invite more people to join in. A welcoming environment is one that fosters belonging, so asking those already present questions that anyone can answer. What do you need to participate? Ableism, the discrimination imposed on the disabled population, is so deeply woven into society's storytelling, it is everywhere, but yet also unremarkable, and thus can be ignored easily. Much like ideas of classism and racism, you may not have the words for it even if you are subject to it. Like many women, it took me many years to become a feminist, because it took time to find the ideas that gave me a working definition. See blog Am I Disabled? Once I realized I had a choice, all my activity became anti-sexist. Slowly, it became easier to understand that while my experience was the prejudice I received, books on feminism gave me the language to articulate institutional sexism, misogyny and patriarchy. Together, these ideas gave depth and nuance to complexities of structure in our culture, which beyond each individual, weighed more heavily on women as a global population. Hidden assumptions. Our culture can be viewed as what we say, and how we say it. Language matters because what gets the most airtime in conversation becomes our reality, a shared narrative. The shortcuts we take, for example in office or technical terminology, phrases like vulnerable individuals do not help convey complexity. Often they stop us questioning many of the assumptions within the concepts they convey. For example, does the phrase mean people need access requirements? Or does the phrase stand for a label of ability, an illness, or worse, a personal failure? Consider your experience. 50 years ago, ableism hadn't been invented, it wasn't something you could be accused of. To what extent have you experienced discrimination? Sexism, racism, homophobia, classism, religious intolerance, rejection of family or personal choice. Maybe you faced several at once. The impact on Black working class women will be cumulatively higher. The evidence is significant. 2. Disadvantage and discrimination. While many disabled people enjoy their lives, most have probably struggled to have their rights upheld in public spaces. For professionals, the challenge is to view organizational change as an imperative in delivering equality. More specifically, a pragmatic equality, or justice for disabled people, that requires the view that discrimination does not add to the other injustices in the world. Another way of thinking about it might be to say that a world that is equal in respect of disability is as unfair to disabled people as it is to non-disabled people. At an organizational level, disabled people face far greater barriers than most imagine. Disadvantage is far more complicated than a lack of individual fit. Disabled people have no less experience, skill or wisdom than their non-disabled colleagues. This suggests that negative perception, and ways of working that are unfair, play a part in maintaining the barriers disabled people say they experience. It is this experience that is rarely sought, because it rarely seems important to those not at a disadvantage. Sadly, while there is good evidence that all types of difference have been accommodated somewhere, it is still far more typical that overall patchy non-discriminatory practice is rare. Strategies employed need to benefit to both disabled individuals and those in the wider community proportionately in order to be equal. Evidence. A well-informed guess. In an organization of 1,000 employees, 100 workers will probably have one impairment or more, whether or not they identify as disabled. Across localities, that is 7.7 million people in the United Kingdom. Yet there are only 53.6% of disabled people in employment, compared to 81% of non-disabled people. 9 in 10 disabled individuals say they have experienced hate crime over the past year, and most will express this as a personal failure, not as abuse or victimization. Disabled people are more likely to live in poverty, because it costs £570 more on average a month to live with the costs of an impairment. People with mental health issues are 11 times more likely to be victimized, report being bullied, live in poverty and struggle in education and employment. Cost to society. Not addressing the inequality and discrimination disabled people face in the workplace is a costly problem. While the matter rarely comes up for discussion, as many no doubt believe organizations reflect the community they serve, sadly the evidence is overwhelming. Prejudice and systemic discrimination impact in negative ways on the health of some, and the well-being of us all. The harm caused by discrimination has ultimately a price societies need to pay for. At the heart of responsible business, therefore, is an imperative to address this injustice perpetuates unsustainable costs by passing on the price. Not solely at operational level, but at strategic, taking equality seriously, and developing strategies as a route to a better fulfillment of governance responsibilities. Because the distinctive nature of any disadvantage prevents more equitable participation, addressing it becomes a matter of investment in the well-being of our communities. As a global issue, matters of sustainability rarely give disabled people a voice in a worldwide conversation. Globally, the threefold risk experienced by disabled people during the current COVID-19 pandemic results from a greater risk of negative outcomes from the disease itself, a greater risk of reduced access to routine healthcare and rehabilitation which differentially affects them, and the damaging impacts of policy, strategy and planning efforts to mitigate the pandemic. An ethical crisis. For many years, groups of activists, those opposing sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, have drawn our attention to hate crime, discrimination, societal disadvantage and global inequality. You'll be aware of the Me Too campaign and the Black Lives Matter movement. As a civil rights group within this movement, disabled people and deaf and disabled people's organizations have fought for the rights of the disabled population for half a century. More specifically, the Disabled People's Movement has mobilized on a shared list of interests, unlike charities and research which tend to focus on a single problem, most often problems defined by non-disabled clinicians or researchers acting on their assumptions about disabled people's lived experience or the interests. Three, respectful language. How do we articulate the assumptions many can ignore? Research suggests the difference between political correctness and respectful language is not whether a word is right or wrong, but why the meaning strengthens or counters a narrative that exists in everyday storytelling. The language we use about disability is typically negative and often medical. Professionals will often feel more comfortable talking about a diagnosis, impairment or conditions than discrimination and inequality. Thus, we often talk in ways that merely repeat the stereotypes we've heard in everyday conversations. Current terminology is limited. For example, the word disability is used to indicate personal difference, labeled group and inequality. It's not whether particular words are right or wrong. Respectful language encourages each of us to think about the meaning and the context of our choice. Saying the wrong word in conversation is rarely as problematic as silence. Most people are fairly flexible, as long as they feel others are willing to respect their experience, knowledge and wisdom. Issues arise when there are unclear boundaries between private matters or identity, group interest and assumed stereotypes and lack of positive regard in public debate. In organization documents, terminology is far more critical, because it is the language used that defines the organization's culture. Think of greenwashing. Making an organization's activity sound ethical doesn't make it less environmentally damaging. Language. In the textual world, the words vulnerable, needy, special and differently abled are often used to describe those labeled whether they like it or not. This helps create a belief, if not the idea, that it's the person who has needs, rather than the support that is needed. Current terminology is woefully limited. We rely on meaning, not word. Disability is used to indicate personal difference, labeled group, oppression, characteristic, discrimination and inequality. Be specific. We need to talk in different ways to individuals, about groups, and about chunks of population. When speaking to individuals, use names or surnames appropriately, ask about preferred identity, respect choice and personal articulation of experience. For example, Joe enjoys philosophy, says he is autistic and does not identify as disabled. Julie, on the other hand, prefers Jules, identifies as disabled with a capital D, and fights the discrimination she has experienced. When speaking about disabled people, make sure you articulate the group as a network, community or population depending on what you are trying to say. Not all disabled people share the same interests, know each other, or have similar identity or activism. Look for guidance, evidence or articulation provided by authors, groups or organizations. Start with DPO's, Deaf and Disabled People's Organization. For example, Disability Rights UK shares information about the interests of the disabled population, a voice for a huge group across many communities. Inclusion London is a deaf and disabled people's organisation articulating the rights of people facing discrimination in the South East. The disabled population, place groups within society, and a presence within other groups. State clearly, for example, that 1 in 10 feminists are likely to be disabled women, 2 in 10 people can identify if they chose, and statistically 20% of the population is likely to have an impairment. Develop a multi-tiered terminology. While we will need to seek to understand an alternative experience, speaking with more confidence about barriers, discrimination and inequality helps us articulate conversations about disability regarding individuals, groups and populations differently. It is not up to disabled employees or disabled clients to be more fluent about their experience. Forests of documents on this topic already exist. The onus is on us as professionals to articulate the prejudice individuals endure, the barriers facing disabled people, and discrimination and inequality weighing on the disabled population. Thought bias and barriers. Institutional norms shape our professional ideas about our everyday practice. We might be aware of unfair rules or expectations, having encountered them ourselves as barriers. Other beliefs may be so deeply buried in our language that we rarely question them at all. So, how do we build confidence in articulating the stereotypes that lead to bias and spot the barriers that hinder progress? As a wise woman once said, political correctness changed the words, but did not change the conversation. Learning to unlearn. There are 5 myths that broadly distort the way we talk about disability that misrepresents disabled people in organizational storytelling. Adding stereotypes to the representation of disabled individuals, groups, communities and society. These distortions reinforce ideas that deny the experience of disabled individuals, the knowledge of disabled people's groups, associations and networks, and therefore the interests of the disabled population more widely. Myth 1. Illness and institutional practice. Where in conversation and in documents illness and disability are used interchangeably, disability is seen as an individual problem in need of cure. As a problem it is perceived as a personal issue, and largely for someone else's budget. Where practice cannot or professionals will not change, disabled people are more likely to be sent elsewhere. Myth 2. Scale. The real number of people who could identify as disabled is large, 1 or 2 in 10. Some may have a visible difference, while many do not. It's good practice, therefore, to articulate the disabled population as a global majority, rather than a minority group. Myth 3. Fitting in. Disabled people are often viewed as completely separate group, yet they are among the women, LGBTQ+, Black and people of color, and older people we refer to as the civil rights movement. This separation tends to draw a line between us and them. And in identifying some as subgroups, rather than part of a bigger population facing multiple barriers, the idea of privilege is viewed as a luxury, not an absence of disadvantage. Myth 4. Organisational silence. Following the medical myth, disabled people as a group are often seen as the responsibility of other departments, organisations or institutions, rather than the cost to society of not employing or poorly paying disabled workers. It would be better to see any extra cost as a good investment that secures the health of whole localities and the well-being of communities more widely. Myth 5. Not respecting private boundaries. In conversations, more specifically about disclosure, impairment and identity are often conflated. This means that discrimination and inequality are often ignored, with the focus of what's wrong imposed on the disabled individual. For example, when saying they have a disability rather than they are disabled. Left unchallenged, these myths, often evident in stereotypes, lead to prejudice, a reaction to the myth, not the person. Reactive practice, such as the justifications for not working with disabled people, keeps assumptions going. The good news is that once these ideas are more clearly articulated, they are more easily recognized in conversation, and more easily avoided in text. Five. Systemic discrimination and society's injustice. Myths allow a misrepresentation is most evident in the textual world, where a noticeable silencing acts to tell of disabled people as untrustworthy group of speakers. Myths will distort the way an organizational story is told, and why consequently so few spaces are free from discrimination. No one questions what they do not, or no longer, see. For many the scale of this disadvantage is a revelation, and many will underestimate cost to industry and communities. Professional wisdom is a beautiful thing, especially when applied to organizational practice and relationships. Often the dissonance in people's minds is so great that few can see beyond their own beliefs, and enables them to defend their own behavior, even with ableism defined on a slide before their eyes. This silencing is most evident in the textual world, where misrepresentation articulates them as untrustworthy group of speakers. Furthermore, they are not recognized as authors, thereby denied a voice as writers of knowledge in documents that reinforce their marginalization. Implications for organizations. Distortions reinforce ideas that deny the experience of disabled individuals, the knowledge of disabled people's groups, associations and networks, and therefore the interests disabled population more widely. At organizational level the issue is greater than a lack of individual fit, since disabled workers have no less experience, skill or wisdom than their non-disabled colleagues. While all type of difference have been accommodated somewhere, it still seems barriers are substantial, because overall better practice is patchy. Disabled workers face far greater barriers than most employers imagine. For business leaders, the challenge is therefore to view organizational change as a benefit to both disabled individuals and the wider community their business serves. People trust their personal experience rather than attempting to address their assumptions with research evidence or working wisdom. Their own voice is louder than the alternatives, and their ideas are supported by a wider narrative of misrepresentation. We seem happier to tell and retell our side of the story. Positive action, therefore, needs to address both organization and society strategically. This requires vision at senior management, leadership team and board levels. In order to avoid the time-consuming and costly tweaks at operational level that rarely alter culture or company purpose. While few do nothing, and most do something, far more could be done at strategic level to alter culture. Adopting an allied position. Speaking with authority isn't just any conversation. Dialogue needs to extend in a deliberate direction. While good, best and proactive practice sometimes equate, and operational strategies can also be strategic, positive action on both levels is rarely unintentional. Because being better at treating people unfairly does not achieve more equitable outcomes. Practice might need to change radically in order to avoid the very activity that compounds the structural discrimination and inequality experienced by so many. Addressing discrimination and inequality simultaneously is like tapping your head while rubbing your tummy. Different actions are required at individuals, team and organizational levels. Do-do list. If the language used in organizations can be identified as causing the negative beliefs that strengthen BIS, then seeking different words in order to have an alternative a dialogue may be useful. People also say that it's lists of do not say that makes them fearful of broaching the subject. To avoid the myths deliberately a do-do list answers the question what can I say? Do ask people what they need to participate. Before a conversation about reasonable adjustments is possible, it is always a good idea to ask easier questions about flexible working. A question most professionals can answer also allows disabled people the choice of whether to disclose or not. Allow for personal choice and respect privacy boundaries. Matters such as illness, impairment and difference, contrary to society's storytelling, are private. Do talk about the size of the disabled population, stressing vast numbers, huge inequality, lack of visibility and wide variation. This helps contradict the assumption that disabled individuals are few and far between, a separate group. When in fact disabled people are among those also facing sexism, racism, homophobia, and religious intolerance. Do highlight the discrimination imposed on the entire disabled population. Articulate professional identity separately, because respecting choice helps us all focus on the unfair disadvantage, without having to interrogate personal difference. Do make the assumption that disabled people have fought. Because to be visible an individual will have had to overcome huge barriers in order to achieve the life goals many can take for granted. Do refer to deaf and disabled people's organizations as the voice of the disabled population and speaking to their interests. Individual stories are important, but lived experience is just the first step, the bare minimum, we need to hear. Seek those who articulate both the institutional discrimination and systemic inequality disabled people face. Do refer to the societal and environmental aspects of discrimination, as ableism, in the same way as you would have a speak in anti-racist or anti-sexist terms. Do state that organizational culture, and more broadly society, does not do enough to speak of the injustice the disabled population are subject to, a failure to uphold human rights that is ultimately a cost to all communities. Do ask about identity, but allow individuals not to identify and still be asked what they need to participate. It is far more respectful, once a professional relationship has been established, to ask individuals about the barriers they face. Disabled individuals will have different words for their experience, professional knowledge and working wisdom, as do feminists. Six, responding to disability equality. Seeking and responding to lived experience is essential yet an unsatisfactory minimum, as personal matters, however troubling, only illuminate the prejudice and barriers at individual level. Furthermore, we can't ask every disabled person in turn what they understand by discrimination, without imposing on their time and generosity, and reminding them of the harm they've endured. We need to trust the voices those who have also gained research evidence and professional wisdom on these matters. Disability equality gives us frame, a language, like torchlight in the darkness, that highlights a specific sensitivity to ableism. As feminism gives us a sensitivity to sexism in the male gaze. Through its lens, disability equality helps us question the ableism in ideology by highlighting misrepresentation in discourse. From books to people. Disabled people express as their interests, the story they tell, in a different way to researchers and professionals that have spoken for them in terms of illness or problems. For many this can be viewed as a form testimonial silencing apparent in the telling of globe-local R stories. While storytelling may seem neutral, many authors, unwittingly, tend to focus on personal experience, and if trusted at all, use their own assumptions to replace the evidence or the working wisdom of academics and professionals identifying as disabled. The disability activist and scholar, Oliver, refers to alternative ways storytelling, by questioning experience, knowledge, and investigation from a different perspective. The medical model as asking the question, "What is wrong with you?" And the social model as asking the question, "What is wrong with society?" The disabled people's movement in the UK has used the term disabled for many years. Disabled, rather than people with disabilities, is used to emphasize the idea that disabled people are disabled by the world rather than being different. This also implies that the oppression imposed on disabled people has a character, ableism. For a growing number, therefore, using the term disabled reflects a journey, a step into a movement. It is a choice to write, and co-author, on shared interest, speaking with activism and with intent to disrupt existing narratives and the myths they convey. Definitions. Without a definition, there is no way of identifying the characteristic discrimination imposed on disabled people. If we don't speak about ableism, it doesn't exist, because it is not something we give time to or that we acknowledge. I work to two definitions based on what I've read. Ableism, a specific type of oppression, akin to homophobia, racism, classism, ageism, and sexism, held in the culture and language that inform society's debates. Anti-ableist, a defined position against ableism, the characteristic oppression that disabled people face as in feminist or anti-racist. Theorizing, for example, with an anti-ableist legitimacy involves explicit reference to disabled people as tellers in a storytelling that holds their interests at their heart. 7. Accountability. With disabled people's interests in mind, accountability refers to the intent to articulate an account that acknowledges disability equality as the frame within organization purpose. Suggested by Sinclair's writings, the idea of a chameleon serves well as a metaphor for accountability. Because, as an animal that can change its colors to represent what it stands by, as the picture illustrates, the beastie still manages to clearly display its position without changing its being. Human rights. An organization wishing to represent its human rights imperative can choose to state the interests of the disabled population within its accounts by making them explicitly within its storytelling, thereby still keeping its integrity and purpose. This implies its responsibility to also provide a trustworthy account of that dialogue. If the dialogue is skewed, the population is misrepresented, then those that are entitled to have a voice in the conversation are effectively silenced. The account is no longer proof of legitimacy, as it does not articulate equity, a shared decision about interests and fair participation in stewardship. The legitimacy gap identified earlier is a breakdown of trust where reputation lacks any acknowledgement of disabled people, disability equality or the interests of the disabled people's movement. This is a lack of legitimacy in organizational accounts within mainstream storytelling. A shorthand for lack of accountability, the gap is often a prejudiced response, a reaction to the myths, rather than acknowledgement of shared voice. The legitimacy gap refers to the amount organizational storytelling differs from interests, disabled people's organization. A shorthand for lack of accountability, the legitimacy gap refers to the amount organizational storytelling differs from interests, disabled people's organization. Professionals who acknowledge the medical model's significance can more ably respond in both personal and a public conversation by talking of barriers and injustice in their accounts. Pragmatic equality, or justice for disabled people, requires that discrimination does not add to the other injustices in the world. Responsibility. Storytelling. A recognizable telling is useful for guiding organizational conversations away from ideas of individualized or medicalized problems, and instead encouraging shared responsibility. Notions of ownership here is critical, recognizing disabled people as a civil rights group, a legitimate voice for human rights accountability. An understanding that perpetuates discrimination, and that society continues to marginalize, segregate, exclude and abuse disabled individuals based on ableist storytelling. As divergent voices, disabled storytellers offer an alternative storytelling. But ensuring the organizational storytelling is accountable to a group is not the responsibility of one policy or a single department. The idea that disability has a standalone file conflicts with the idea that every worker can respond willingly and effectively to avoid discrimination. The task is to alter environments to tackle disadvantaged, the responsibility is shared. This presentation. Together, the sections spell out an alternative understanding of working with disabled people. Starting with language, workplace culture can change, and the transformation depends on us to follow the lead of the disabled community *, more specifically those who have actively challenged the attack on their human rights. The document provides an extended terminology that will help you to talk with increasing confidence about the individual disabled person, their skills, experience and knowledge. Ableism: the barriers, negative attitudes and working practices faced by disabled people but not by their non-disabled colleagues within organizations, sectors or professions, for example fear, lack of awareness, avoidance, microaggression, stares, complex or incomplete policies. Myths: the misrepresentation or silencing in documents, communications and wider storytelling of organizations. Impairment, condition, difference or functioning, private information, the disclosure of which is a disabled individual's choice to disclose. The same is true for their identity as a disabled person. It is all very good news, as addressing the prejudice, discrimination and inequality disabled workers face.